Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 21 of Series 8. The question for today is, how can we explain the emergence of mind from matter without discontinuities? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 6. So in this series we've been discussing various features of consciousness. Features like structure, graduation, mysteriousness, nothingness, obfuscation, cognition and effect. Today I want to talk about the origins and emergence of mind and consciousness. Paul Davies says that this is arguably the hardest problem facing science today, and David Chalmers has described it as the hard problem of consciousness. There are several reasons for this difficulty. Firstly, in my view, we have to use the right method for the subject matter in hand, which isn't usually done. For example, a priori and necessary relations are appropriate for logic and mathematics. A posteriori observations and empirical judgments are required in the physical sciences. But these two methods seem to have been misapplied to mind or consciousness. And phenomenology employs a different method of internal apprehension and description. Phenomenology may have shortcomings, but it nevertheless offers a more appropriate method. Secondly, and relatedly, the questions what is mind and what are the preconditions of mind are often conflated. This is because physicalists claim that neurological events aren't just preconditions but constitute the mind. Yet anti-physicalists often accept that neurological events correspond with mental events. This renders the brain as the prime or perhaps sole candidate for a precondition of mind. So we can begin with two or three widely accepted candidates of preconditions for consciousness. 1. The only instances of consciousness that we can reliably cite are products of brains. 2. Consciousness correlates with increased complexity in the brain and mind. And 3. On the axiom that consciousness is conscious of something, consciousness needs an external world to be conscious of. Yet as an indication of one kind of complexity, many other factors have been considered as necessary but not sufficient preconditions of consciousness. These have included life, structure, social interaction, quantum mechanics, temporality, information, bodily action, language, and particular kinds of brain constituents. Yet the primary candidate for a precondition of consciousness is a living brain. This is because 1. We can only find instances of minds or consciousness in brains, and conscious AI is not yet produced, and spirits or ghosts are very unlikely. And 2. Linkages between mental states and brain in fMRI indicate dependence on mind on brain. But exact correspondence in linkages between brain and mind have not yet been established. This causes David Chalmers, Joseph Levine, and others to speak of an explanatory gap. And such uncertainty has led Donald Davidson to a position of anomalous monism. A further problem for correspondence is a demonstrable loss of cerebral cortex without loss of consciousness. For example, hydrocephalus in infants destroys most of the brain without loss of consciousness, and the 1848 accident of Phineas Gage's loss of frontal lobe left him conscious and functioning. Such facts have led to the view that there's been an overemphasis of brain neurology in explaining mind. Ted Honderich explains this as the impulse to etherealize or cranialize consciousness. Others have described this tendency in similar terms. Sean Gallagher speaks of neurocentrism, Ron Harry of a neurological fallacy, and Raymond Tallis talks about neuromania. Following this thinking, Alver No holds we have made a category error in misunderstanding mind. That is, understanding mind in terms of brain is like understanding monetary value in terms of metallurgy. No presents mind as a relation, process, or interaction between a centre and external objects. Numerous thinkers, such as Thomas Metzinger, are developing such a relational and process view of consciousness. And Riccardo Manzotti sees externalism as going beyond the brain in a process relating to the world. Externalism regards relations, events and experiences in the world as complex and as necessary as brain events. One argument for this is that brains without worlds can't produce consciousness, that is, like a brain in a vat. To illustrate externalism, we can use Georges Bataille's metaphor of mind as water in a bottle. Yet we can modify the metaphor to consciousness as a liquid in a container. Here, the walls of the container are the cognitive frameworks which support and shape the mental liquid. And the liquid in the container can represent mental states of different qualities and viscosities. Externalism posed two initial preconditions of consciousness. One, an external world, as well as two, the brain. That is, externalism still needs brains that need to be made of something, that are three, its constituents. And it matters what constituents something is made of. An engine made of wood, for example, will not work. And we don't know if silicon or non-living or non-carbon structures can produce consciousness. And Stuart Hameroff holds that consciousness may be explained in quantum collapse of microtubules. These points indicate that there may be unknown constituents in explaining consciousness. Another crucial precondition of consciousness is 4. The structure of the brain as well as its constituents and externality. A jumbled mass of neurons without structure won't produce consciousness. We don't know what the salient structures of the brain are, yet we know that they are complex. This introduces the fifth feature of complexity as a precondition of consciousness. But just complexity isn't sufficient. The cosmos is complex but not conscious. The complexity of computers is often cited as a sufficient condition of consciousness. But consciousness needs constituents, externality and structure as well as complexity. David Chalmers poses a structural account in response to what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. That is, the problem of explaining how any physical system gives rise to conscious experience at all. Unquote. Yet we can see this as a version of Hume's fork and his skepticism about causation that he calls constant conjunctions. That is, we can never definitively prove causations because they can only be observed empirically. In Chalmers' hard problem, we are dealing with two kinds of events, material and conscious. so the hard problem may be technically impossible to resolve. Yet this doesn't mean that we can't continually improve our explanations. In Chalmers' structural account, identical structures of functional organizations produce identical experiences. He calls this the organizational invariance of functional organizations which produce experiences, whether the organization is realized in silicon chips or in beer cans or in ping pong balls. John Searle holds that this asks too much of structure and ignores the importance of its constituents, and a system may have to imitate every aspect in that it would have to be a virtual replication. Yet Chalmers needs this structure in the form of organizational invariance for at least two reasons. One, the need for a common feature to link changes between matter and consciousness. And two, the need for continuity to rule out the possibility of suddenly disappearing qualia or mental states, because he says such would require brute discontinuities in fundamental laws. What these fundamental laws are is uncertain, yet ontological and explanatory continuity is certainly desirable. But many other theorists like Gazanaga, Richard Rorty and Max Velmans also reject discontinuities. But organizational invariance is only a claim, as Chalmers admits. It doesn't, and as Chalmers admits, it doesn't explain emergence. So for a continuous transition from matter to consciousness, Chalmers also uses the notion of information. He uses information both as an intermediary and as a precondition of consciousness. He notoriously claims that wherever there is causal interaction, there is information and there is also experience. And if there is experience associated with thermostats, there is probably experience everywhere. Searle finds Chalmers' claim about thermostats absurd and takes issue with his ambiguous use of information. For example, rain hitting the ground can convey information, but not in the sense of containing data. So Chalmers uses information to make an unbroken transition from physicality to consciousness. But I argued against this use of information 7 weeks ago. Basically, the argument was that information implies anthropocentricity and cognition, which can't exist without consciousness. And if information can't exist without consciousness, it can't be a precondition of consciousness. Searle makes the same point with respect to our conception of the processes within a computer. He writes that its operations can be specified purely formally, and that the symbols have no material meaning. They have to be specified purely in terms of their formal or syntactical structure. So to explain continuity in the emergence of consciousness, Chalmers employs 3 features. 1, structural organization, which Chalmers admits isn't adequate by itself. 2, an information theory of mind, which both Searle and myself has argued against and rejected. And 3, his infamous claim of conscious thermostats and its associated theory of panpsychism, tackled shortly. Yet there are at least 3 things that we can profitably use in Chalmers' account. 1, the need of some form of functional organization to account for structure and complexity. 2, a way of explaining gradual and natural changes without brute discontinuities discussed 3 weeks ago. And 3, the relation or causal interaction, as Chalmers calls it, that we can take further here. Max Velmans is one theorist who provides an interactionist account of consciousness in relation to the world. And he also describes a graduation or different levels of interaction, both reflexive and within the body. That is, on the surface of the body, within the body, or within the brain itself. Yet although, like Chalmers, Velmans is a panpsychist, he goes further to believe in a reflexive universe. Ian McGilchrist similarly regards matter as a phase of consciousness. These views are known as absolute consciousness, as more fundamental than matter, but none of them decisively explain the final relation between mind and matter. The notion of absolute consciousness is, however, common in ancient Indian or Vedic thought. The Advaita philosophy of Sankara holds that this is a substratum of the universe, even finer than energy. Sankara answers the problematic difference between the absolute and this world with superimposition. That is, absolute consciousness did not become this world, it only appears to have done so. But this is metaphysical or theological hyperbole that doesn't resolve crucial problems. These are, what produced the consciousness, and how can consciousness produce matter? And the panpsychism of Chalmers, Velmans, McGilchrist and Vedic thought is subject to a devastating criticism. Chalmers oddly states that seems to be no knockdown arguments against this view of panpsychism. But consciousness has only been defined with properties like sentience and cognition. And sentience and cognition are not properties of and can't be found in the physical world. So it's illegitimate to describe the supposed property as consciousness. Yet some theorists like Michael Gazzaniga look to biological life to explain continuity between life and matter. Gazzaniga and Howard Patty say the schism between life and matter as the mother of all gaps, and they hope that bridging that gap will explain consciousness. Life is an intuitive beginning of mind, as from chemistry to biology and to mind. But there are problems. Life is an arbitrary distinction of uncertain beginnings in a process of increasing complexity. Life does not offer definitive or crucial features of transition to mind. And life is an essential precondition, rules out artificial consciousness that I'm not prepared to do. But as we will see shortly, life has an essential place in explaining the graduation of mind. Yet there's another theory that we haven't considered yet that goes under the name of Panprotopsychism. Panprotopsychism isn't that mind is everywhere, but that there's an ubiquitous property that produces mind. The unanswered question here is, what is this ubiquitous property? I want to suggest that it is matter itself in complex interactions with itself that produces consciousness. This would satisfy all the concerns expressed in terms of continuity, panpsychism or physicalism. And an interactionist theory of mind should be able to bridge the gap between physicality and mind. The question then is how to explain and demonstrate such a process of interaction. We could start with the idea that there's an interaction between all matter that is also seminal to producing mind. And in the case of mind, that interaction isn't just causal, but a registration of and presence to objects. Yet for a continuity of explanation of mind from matter, we need to explain three relations with the same principle. One, the kind of relation that exists between physical objects generally regarded as causality. Two, the crucial relation between physical objects that produces mind or consciousness. And three, the interactive relation between physical objects and mind or consciousness. For example, perceptions of objects that influence mind and various feedback loops. Firstly, all objects have relations with other objects. These relations are uncontentiously described as causal. But as noted earlier, causality is neither a definitive concept or completely explains physical relations. For example, singular causal relations aren't adequate and have to be replaced by complex causal fields. This begins to extend the idea of causal and physical relations. In this way, the relations that objects have with each other can also be described as a presence to something. That is, any two objects have relations and a presence to each other. For example, two billiard balls are related by gravity, drafts of air, quantum entanglement, and so forth. Yet the property of being presence to something is also common to mind and consciousness. For instance, Sartre frequently uses the terminology of being presence to something, and consciousness is commonly described as consciousness of something. My point is that the relation of being present to something is common to both physical and conscious interactions, and that the property of being present to something provides a continuity between matter and mind. This kind of relation could be advanced further by comparison with Whitehead's concept of prehension. This describes how consciousness relates to objects in the same way that objects relate to each other. Whitehead called this relation prehension, entailing a Platonic logos and a process of creativity. For him, the process of creativity brings consciousness into existence and is a property of consciousness. He also held a graduated conception of mind that he viewed as process instead of a substance. Yet Whitehead is also a panpsychist who employs a cosmological and an ultimately religious metaphysics. So we regard this notion of prehension as metaphorical thinking, yet it serves as an introductory idea. But we need a more acceptable feature that also underlies both matter and consciousness. Thomas Nagels suggests what he calls psychophysical monism, that also poses a property that is common to both mind and matter, and thereby explains a shared understanding of both mind and matter. He says that conscious mental properties and their neurophysiological conditions are not distinct but inseparable aspects of some one thing for which we do not at present have a concept, but which are natural mental and physical concepts currently represented incompletely and inadequately, unquote. But Nagel's suggestion is both speculative and a project for a future monism. And like Whitehead, I want to start an explanation at the beginning of a spectrum of interaction before life. And we can also consider how simple relations can undergo significant developments. For example, billiard balls or atoms interact in many ways, gravitationally, causally, aerodynamically, and so forth. But these are simple relations which don't produce even infinitely low levels of consciousness. But some events are also complex, contained systems which have structure, feedback, and qualify as interactions. For example, engines, machines, computers with cause and effect in repetitious and continuous processes. Complexity increases in systems like quantum computers, plants, single-celled life like amoebas. These entities are integrated systems with complex interactions that register objects. These interactions and registrations may mimic but don't amount to recognition or cognition. Further complexity includes insects, animals, apes, and humans with increasing consciousness. But I argued earlier that complexity or even organization and certain constituents are not sufficient. The crucial factor isn't complexity, but relations of engagement, registration, and presence to something. These relations simulate intentionality towards objects, that consciousness is conscious of something. This provides a continuity of explanation from all causal interactions to consciousness. This is a form of panprotopsychism, not that consciousness is everywhere, but that properties that give rise to consciousness. This could be a trivial claim, but details of the property are crucial. I call them the details of interaction. The big remaining difficulty of interactionist panprotopsychism is conceiving how matter becomes mind. We still need another salient property to explain the three noted object-to-object and object-to-mind relations. These kinds of relation can all be described with the same principle that are described in the following way: as a presence to something, registering of something, and attending to something, or as apprehending something, influencing something, or previously as Whitehead's prehension. We can consider these properties as part of a process of continuous development. Causal object-to-object relations develop into complex chemical relations. Complex chemical relations develop into simple life forms like bacteria and amoeba. Amoeba register the world as single organisms with feedback mechanisms. Now consider insects with perceptions of objects in the world in which they move. Insects see something, have a form of cognition, yet they may not be conscious. We can lastly consider simple animals like mice, which are conscious, have cognition, and also sentient. Humans are conscious with perceptions complex enough to recognize their own existence. The process of development can be described as one of causal interaction into registration, then consciousness, and finally self-consciousness. The hypothesis here is that it's not complexity that produces consciousness, but sophistication of registration. Yet complexity remains one of the many preconditions required to produce consciousness. The key here is that the fundamental relation between objects and consciousness is the same. That is, relation between objects has the same structure as the relation that produces consciousness. That is, a presence to something, registering of something, or apprehending something. It's significant that there's a consensus that consciousness is conscious of something. I have cited insects as a part of a developmental transition towards consciousness. But do creatures like insects bridge the gap between mechanical and conscious processes? Is insect registration automated, atomistic, mechanical, and non-conscious? Or does insect registration involve some aspect of cognition? Insects see something, but what? Are insect perceptions mapped onto a larger picture as required of a precursor of consciousness? On this point, Max Velmans quotes Van Swinden's 2007 study of the selective attention of fruit flies. Van Swinderen goes on to demonstrate that selective attention requires short-term memory. Selection is also a mode of choice regarded by many as a fundamental constituent of consciousness. Selective attention as proto-choice, together with memory, are features of consciousness. This indicates that insect registration is a primogenitor or precursor of consciousness. Yet insect selection is also machine-like, as well as having mentalistic features. My conclusion is that registration, selection, and interaction have features that close the explanatory gap. These have the structure of presence to something that simulates the structures of consciousness. But there's a problem of adopting interaction as a salient feature of panprotopsychism. There were many factors like life, structure, brain, external world, social interaction, and time. So how can we choose any one particular feature as explaining the emergence of consciousness? There is a classic problem of complex causal fields rather than singular causes. For example, why did Jack fall off the ladder? Was he too fat? Was the ladder weak? Or was he inattentive? It seems to be arbitrary to name any one of these factors as the cause. Two reasons why interaction and presence to can be taken as the salient property that produces consciousness. One, it has continuity of existence and explanation from basic causality to reflective consciousness. And two, the structure of presence to something is shared by intentionality and consciousness of something. This structure is present throughout the preconditions and development of consciousness. But there is also a problem of determining, even in principle, when consciousness emerges from matter. When is there some degree of consciousness rather than none? When does zero become one? This could be answered by rejecting, in principle, a definitive point of emergence. And two concepts explain why this should be done: indeterminability and the concept of graduation. In the colour spectrum, for example, there is no definitive point when one colour becomes another. And in Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, speed and location of a particle can't be determined. So the question of zero becoming one needs to look past binary values to indeterminability and graduation. In our case, I hold that indeterminability or fuzziness is produced by the ontology of the mind-matter threshold. But there is also an epistemological or observer-relative issue of determining the criterion of interaction. That is, the criterion of interaction is chosen according to the observer's understanding of these events, but that understanding must be relative at the level of the mind-matter threshold. I will come back to this idea shortly. But on the ontology, I suggest imagining particles of mind and matter described as quanta or quarks respectively. Then we could conceive of a level at which so-called quanta and quarks interact with each other to such a degree that the threshold can't be described as 0 or one unit of either. Yet a temporal form of indeterminability could also supplement the above structural form of indeterminability. That is, our so-called quanta and quarks would interact with each other in different proportions through time. But there is also an observer relative issue concerning the 0-1 problem. That is, at whatever level the 0-1 threshold is set, why should it be conceived as 0-1 and not the 0.5 or 0 infinity, which would reduce the 0-1 problem to 0? Another aspect of this observer relative indeterminability is that at this level of mind and matter interaction, Hameroff and Roger Penrose have argued that quantum events must be taken into account, and it is widely argued that quantum events are observer relative. In conclusion, despite Chalmers' hard problem and Paul Davies' view of arguably the hardest problem facing science today, a plausible hypothesis for explaining the origins of consciousness has been outlined. One of the difficulties is presenting the problem in a suitable way. To this end, I suggested looking past the binary and ungraduated thinking of Renaissance science. A structural conception of consciousness is facilitated by this way of thinking and understanding. And an interactionist theory explains mind from an initial causality to conscious relations. And interaction here means presence to something common to all matter and mind. We were also looking for other principles to provide a continuous transition without ontological gaps. And structures like graduation, process and relation enable such a conception of continuity. Then consciousness can be shown to emerge from matter, arising in a continuous and natural way. An argument for such an interactionist view is its simplicity as found in Occam's razor. Next week we'll be asking the final question, what is mind or consciousness? So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or at websites like Zoom or meetup.com.